Contrasting Identities: Knowledge, Privilege, Oppression, and Disadvantage. The previous chapter concerned applying contrastivism to the problem of skepticism, but how can this be applied to IP? The first way contrastivism can be applied is to the distinction between descriptive knowledge and acquainted knowledge. In Chapter 2, I argued that based on group membership, individuals can claim authority of acquainted knowledge over those who are not members of that group. However, I did mention that this does not give the group member authority in relation to descriptive knowledge. For example, it is conceivable that an African American will know what it's like to live the life of someone who is black more than someone who is white. But this same person could have no knowledge of the civil rights movement, the history of slavery, statistics of police violence, and so on. So, contrastivism can express this as someone who has knowledge in contrast to acquaintance, but does not have knowledge in contrast to description. If we were to take Senator Armstrong's Pyrrhonian standard to contrastivism to mean that we cannot discuss relevance at all, then this is all we can say about the matter. However, since my approach allows discussions about relevance, we need to apply how relevance interacts with these two contrast classes. The relevance can be illuminated by returning to Hume's law, HL, discussed previously in Chapter 3's Intersectionality and the Oppression Olympics. When we observed in Chapter 6 evidence regarding having a diversity in identity influence having a greater diversity in ideas, this is best explained by the influence acquainted knowledge has not only on the facts that we know, but the values we hold. This was especially true regarding the correlation between gender quotas and government policies. Even though in these governments men and women would have comparatively equal descriptive knowledge on the policies they needed to vote on, it was the acquainted knowledge that influenced the difference in values. Therefore, this resulted in voting on different policies. Hence, our application of contrastivism can say that someone can have knowledge in contrast to description, which is relevant in respect to facts, and someone can have knowledge in contrast to acquaintance, which is relevant in respect to values. One may object that descriptive knowledge can and does influence our values, and this is true. Someone could read statistics that revealed an unacceptably high infant mortality rate and be compelled to advocate for research into addressing such an issue, even though they have no acquainted knowledge of losing a child. But as I mentioned when explaining contrastivism and relevance, relevance can be relativistic. We can see a relativistic approach to relevance applied in people choosing a charity to donate to. Research on what influences people to give to a charity has shown, A. Young Powell, 2013, that one major factor was whether people had a personal relationship to the charity's cause. For example, a charity for breast cancer would be more likely to gain donations from someone who has or is close to someone who has breast cancer. Therefore, the best explanation for the ability to gain diverse ideas from diverse identities is the contrast of description in respect to facts and acquaintance in respect to values. I will now apply contrastivism to the concept of privilege based on identity. The contrast classes for this matter can include, but are not limited to, being white, non-white, upper class, middle class, working class, lower class, cisgender, and LGBTQIA. White male privilege will now be considered. If we include the contrast of economic class, then we can explain how to understand the circumstances of a wealthy black woman and a homeless white man. The nuances can be illuminated by considering the contrast classes. Through contrastivism, we can say that the homeless man is privileged in contrast to being a white man, but is not privileged in contrast to being a lower economic class. And we can also say that the wealthy woman is not privileged in contrast to being a black woman, but is privileged in contrast with belonging to the upper economic class. An immediate reaction to such a claim may be, how can we say to a homeless person that they are privileged in any kind of way? The answer lies in understanding that privilege, as mentioned in the earlier chapter on the topic, is not only constrained to the economic. Privilege can also be the freedom of having race and gender-based stereotypes imposed on us. Hence, the white homeless man can still be privileged in this way, in contrast to the wealthy black woman. Relevance can once again be applied to the homeless man and the wealthy woman. When we consider the overall state of affairs of both individuals, our intuitions would lead us to conclude that the economic class is the relevant contrast class in this situation, and our intuitions would be correct. However, if we consider a homeless white man and a homeless black woman, the other contrast classes become more relevant. This is because not being privileged due to homelessness is shared by both individuals, whereas the privileges that have social consequences due to race and gender are not shared by both individuals. For example, the homeless woman will be more vulnerable to sexual abuse and domestic violence than the homeless man. The same can be said regarding oppression and disadvantage. The homeless man is disadvantaged in contrast to economic class, but is not disadvantaged in contrast to his race or gender. And the wealthy woman is disadvantaged in contrast to her race and gender, but is not in contrast to economic class. For instance, the wealthy black woman is more likely to experience race and gender-based prejudice, harassment, and discrimination than the homeless white man. However, she would not be in contrast to her economic class. Even with these contrast classes acknowledged, most people remain uncomfortable acknowledging any kind of privilege possessed by a homeless man and disadvantage possessed by a wealthy woman. This, I argue, is due to our intuition that the relevant contrast class is economic class. There is a simple way we can assess which contrast classes to deem relevant as the relevant ones. Political philosopher Philip Pettit popularized a method he calls the eyeball test, J. Gelanosi, 2014, which is to ask someone if they could look at someone in the eye and say that they are not disadvantaged or oppressed. If we put the homeless white man and the black wealthy woman next to one another, it would be much harder to pass the eyeball test when speaking to the homeless white man. However, the utility in illuminating all the contrast classes is that it exposes the source of the oppression or disadvantage. If we know the source, we know where the social issues lie for that individual. Furthermore, it illuminates where disadvantages are shared. For the homeless white man and a homeless black woman, their disadvantage is shared in contrast to their economic class, but is not shared in contrast with their race or gender. This consideration will be explored in the final chapter, where I argue how we can, and should, communicate the various contrasts of IP through class analysis. There is something that needs to be addressed regarding our discussion on universal humanism. Although it leads us to insanity to look only at ourselves as human beings. This does not dismiss the identity of being human as a relevant contrast class as well. We can see ourselves as human and as workers, just like we can see ourselves as workers and our race or gender. And regarding political issues, there is a significant issue that impacts all of us through the identity of being human. Climate change. Given the predicted impacts of climate change, applying contrastivism to IP and including being human as an intersecting identity, it becomes immediately clear that climate change achieves the status of the most significant political issue. This is because every IP group, whether it is class, gender, or race, also possesses the identity of being human. However, even with climate change as the main political issue, we can acknowledge that the lower economic classes will experience the impacts more immediately and severely than the upper economic classes. So, whilst climate change is a human issue, it is also a class issue. And because it is a class issue, it is in many respects also a race and gender issue. This is what a contrastive view on identity can do, what a universal humanist, which doesn't include special relationships, cannot. And this is what will be illuminated in the final chapter, where I advise how to communicate IP in the future.